Consciousness is the most intimate and immediate experience of existence. It is not something distant or abstract. It is the lens through which we perceive every moment of life. Yet, for all its immediacy, it remains one of the greatest mysteries humanity has ever faced. Despite decades of effort and incredible advances in neuroscience, we have made little real progress toward answering one fundamental question. Why does it feel like something to be you? Modern science approaches this question by trying to reduce consciousness to brain activity. It claims that if we map neural circuits and measure electrical signals, we'll eventually explain why you experience the color red or the ache of grief. But the reality is far less convincing. No matter how much data we collect, no neural map can explain why subjective experience exists at all. The idea that consciousness is just an emergent property of the brain isn't an answer. It's a placeholder, a story we tell ourselves to avoid confronting something deeper. This is the hard problem of consciousness, the challenge of bridging the chasm between physical processes and subjective experience. But there's another problem, one even deeper and more unsettling. It's not just that we don't have the answer, it's that we're asking the wrong kinds of questions. We've built our scientific worldview on the idea that everything can be broken down into simpler components, molecules, neurons, and so on. But consciousness resists this kind of thinking. The more we try to isolate it, the more it slips through our grasp. What if the real issue isn't that consciousness is complex, but that our understanding of causality is too simple? What if consciousness isn't something you can reduce to one starting point, whether that's neurons firing or a cosmic universal mind? What if it's something much stranger, an interconnected phenomenon where the physical, mental, and even spiritual aspects of existence all arise together, each shaping and shaped by the others? This way of thinking forces us to reconsider everything we assume about consciousness. It challenges not only the reductionist materialism of modern science, but also the non-materialist views that frame consciousness as something separate and superior to the body. Both perspectives fail to capture the truth of what consciousness really is, a system of profound interdependence. To understand it, we need to let go of the idea that mind, body, or spirit comes first, and instead focus on how these elements co-create and influence one another. The stakes of this question go beyond philosophy or science. They touch on what it means to be human, what it means to live, to feel, and to be aware. If we're going to address the hard problem of consciousness, we need more than better tools or more data. We need a better way of thinking, one that moves beyond simple cause and effect to embrace the dynamic, reciprocal nature of existence itself. Modern science, for all its achievements, tends to reduce the complexity of reality into a series of linear chains. One thing causes another, which in turn causes another, like links in a chain. This approach works well in mechanical systems, but consciousness defies this simplification because it isn't mechanical, it's relational. At its core, consciousness operates through triadic and homeostatic relationships, where physical, mental, and spiritual elements are interdependent, dynamically balancing one another. This means that the relationships between these elements aren't just reciprocal, they form a system that is greater than the sum of its parts. Let's break that down. In a triadic model, every element, mind, body, and spirit, exists in relationship to the others. None can be isolated as the first cause or singular source because they all co-arise and influence one another. This is not an abstraction. We see it in everyday phenomena. Take, for example, a simple but profound experience. Stress. Stress begins with a physical trigger, a raised heart rate, an increase in cortisol. This physical state interacts with mental processes such as anxious thoughts or worry. The thoughts in turn amplify the physical response, creating a feedback loop. But this isn't where it ends. Stress also shapes our sense of meaning and purpose, often leading to feelings of disconnection or existential unease, a disruption at the spiritual level. And yet, it's not a one-way process. Meaning and purpose can counteract stress. Reframing a challenge as an opportunity can lower cortisol levels, calm the mind, and restore balance to the system. In this way, the body, mind, and spirit are engaged in a dynamic homeostatic relationship, constantly recalibrating to maintain equilibrium. Here's why this matters. In a triadic framework, causality is no longer a chain with a beginning and an end. It's a web of relationships that operates holistically. The physical affects the mental affects the spiritual, and the spiritual, in turn, affects the physical. This circularity isn't chaotic, it's homeostatic. Each element works in tandem with the others to preserve the system's overall stability. This is why a triadic model is not only more accurate but also as logically compelling as traditional causality. It accounts for complexity without losing coherence because it operates through mutual interdependence, not isolated effects. Let's take another example, one that touches on the core of the hard problem of consciousness, the experience of transcendence. Meditation offers a window into this phenomenon. When someone meditates, they engage in a practice that begins at the physical level, sitting still, regulating their breath, calming their nervous system. These physical actions affect the mental level, quieting intrusive thoughts and bringing focus to the present moment. As mental activity shifts, the spiritual dimension comes into play, a sense of connection, peace, or even unity with something greater. But the influence flows back through the system. The spiritual experience reinforces mental clarity, which strengthens physical calm, which in turn deepens spiritual awareness. The process is self-sustaining, not because any one element dominates, but because all three act together to maintain balance and amplify each other. This triadic, homeostatic framework reveals something profound about consciousness. It is not reducible to any one part of the system. The brain doesn't produce consciousness in isolation, just as the mind doesn't function independently of the body, and spirituality isn't some external force. Consciousness is an emergent property of the relationships between these elements, constantly arising and stabilizing through their dynamic interplay. Reductionist causality struggles with this because it insists on finding a starting point. Is consciousness physical, mental, or spiritual? The triadic model shows us this is the wrong question. Each element exists only in relationship to the others, and their interactions form the fabric of experience itself. This shift from linear causality to triadic relationships isn't just an improvement in our understanding, it's a transformation. It allows us to see consciousness not as a puzzle with missing pieces, but as a living, interdependent system that we are already part of. This framework doesn't reject causality, it refines it. By recognizing that relationships are homeostatic and triadic, we can see how dynamic systems like consciousness operate with the same logical rigor as traditional causality. Only now, they reflect the complexity of life itself. This insight lays the foundation for the next step, rethinking not just our models of consciousness but the way we approach reality as a whole. The debate over consciousness often feels like a tug-of-war between two opposing camps. On one side, we have materialism, which claims that consciousness is entirely reducible to physical processes in the brain. On the other, we have non-materialism, which insists that consciousness is something fundamentally independent of the physical, often portraying it as a universal or spiritual phenomenon that transcends the material world. Both perspectives frame consciousness as something singular and linear, but in doing so they fail to account for its true nature, an emergent, interdependent system where mind, body, and spirit co-create one another. Materialism begins with the brain. It tells us that neurons firing and electrical signals propagating through networks are the source of every thought, feeling, and perception. It is a seductive idea, especially because it's measurable and aligns with our current scientific methods. Materialist approaches have been incredibly successful in mapping the brain and linking neural activity to behavior. But these maps stop short of answering the most fundamental question: why does this activity result in subjective experience? What materialism struggles to confront is the fact that even if we mapped every neuron in your brain, we'd still be left with the unexplainable leap from firing neurons to the vividness of red or the ache of loss. Materialism describes the mechanics but cannot explain the essence. In its efforts to explain consciousness as an emergent property of the brain, Materialism also falls into a deeper problem. It isolates physical processes from the context in which they operate. Consciousness is not just a product of the brain. It is shaped by the body, by mental processes, and by the sense of meaning and connection that we associate with the spiritual. A brain without a body, without thoughts, emotions, and a relationship to the world, would be as meaningless as a song played in a vacuum. Materialism fails because it assumes that one element, the physical, can explain the whole, ignoring the homeostatic relationships that give consciousness its depth. Non-materialism, on the other hand, appears to offer a solution to this failure. It begins not with the brain, but with consciousness itself, asserting that subjective experience is fundamental, independent of physical structures. This view finds support in phenomena that materialism struggles to explain, like near-death experiences, altered states of consciousness, or the sense of unity that emerges in deep meditation. Non-materialist theories often describe consciousness as universal, as something that exists prior to and beyond the physical, a kind of cosmic awareness. While non-materialism seems to address the limitations of materialism, it falls into a similar trap. By positioning consciousness as independent of the physical, it severs the connection between mind, body, and spirit. It assumes that consciousness exists in isolation, floating free from the material world, untouched by the rhythms and processes of life. But this is just as reductive as the materialist view. It simply shifts the starting point. It fails to account for how consciousness expresses itself through the physical and mental, and how these elements, in turn, shape and sustain it. The problem with both perspectives is that they operate on the same flawed assumption, that there must be a single, primary element from which consciousness arises. Materialism declares that element to be the brain. Non-materialism insists it is consciousness itself. Both are caught in a binary framework that demands we choose one over the other. But consciousness doesn't fit into this kind of either-or logic. It's not a question of material or non-material, physical or spiritual. It's a question of relationship. What if consciousness arises not from one element dominating the others, but from the interplay between them? What if it is not a product of the brain alone, nor a purely universal force, but something that emerges dynamically through the constant interaction of mind, body, and spirit? In this view, consciousness isn't static or hierarchical. It's a process, one that unfolds through reciprocal relationships. Your thoughts affect your body. Your body affects your emotions. Your sense of meaning and connection affects both. And all of this happens simultaneously in a homeostatic system that constantly adjusts to maintain balance. Take, for instance, the feeling of awe. Awe is often described as a spiritual experience, a moment of profound connection to something greater than yourself. But awe isn't just spiritual, it's also deeply physical. Your heart rate slows. Your breathing deepens, stress hormones decrease. These physical changes create the conditions for the mental clarity and emotional openness that define awe. But the process doesn't stop there. The mental and emotional states elicited by awe reinforce the sense of spiritual connection, completing the triad and sustaining the experience. No single element, physical, mental, or spiritual, causes awe. It arises through their interaction. This is why the dichotomy between materialism and non-materialism is a false one. Both perspectives try to isolate consciousness from the very relationships that make it possible. Materialism reduces consciousness to the physical. Non-materialism elevates it above the physical. But consciousness doesn't exist in isolation. It exists through the dynamic interplay of mind, body, and spirit, each shaping and being shaped by the others. When we move beyond this dichotomy, we see consciousness for what it truly is, not a puzzle with a missing piece, but a system of interdependent relationships. This realization doesn't just help us understand consciousness, it transforms how we approach it. Instead of asking, is consciousness physical or spiritual? We begin to ask, how do these elements work together to create the richness of experience? And that question opens the door to a deeper and more holistic understanding of what it means to be alive. To move beyond the false dichotomy of materialism and non-materialism, we need to embrace a third way, a perspective rooted in interconnected causality. This perspective recognizes that consciousness is neither reducible to the brain nor separate from it. Instead, it arises through dynamic and reciprocal relationships between the physical, mental, and spiritual dimensions of existence. It is not that one element dominates or precedes the others, it is that each exists in constant interplay, shaping and being shaped by the others in a system of homeostatic balance. This interconnected view of causality is fundamentally different from the linear, unidirectional models that dominate modern thinking. In a linear framework, causality flows in one direction. The brain produces thoughts, or consciousness shapes the body, or spirituality transcends material existence. Each of these ideas, taken in isolation, simplifies and distorts the true nature of consciousness. In reality, causality operates in a triadic web of relationships, where influence flows simultaneously in all directions, creating a system that is dynamic, self-sustaining, and adaptive. The key to understanding this system is homeostasis. In biological terms, homeostasis refers to the process by which living systems maintain stability by constantly adjusting to changes in their environment. But in the context of consciousness, homeostasis takes on a broader meaning. It is not just the body that seeks balance, it is the entire triad of mind, body, and spirit. These elements are interdependent, and their interactions create the conditions for consciousness to arise and evolve. Let's take an example that illustrates this triadic causality in action: the experience of grief. Grief often begins with a physical sensation, a tightening in the chest, a heaviness in the body. This physical state influences the mental, triggering thoughts of loss, memories, and a sense of longing. These thoughts in turn affect the spiritual dimension, raising questions about meaning, connection, and purpose. But the process doesn't stop there. A shift in any one of these elements can ripple through the system. A spiritual insight, a realization about the nature of love or the permanence of change, can ease the mental burden of grief and lighten its physical weight. In this way, grief is not something that happens to one part of us. It is a whole system experience, and its resolution requires a whole system response. This kind of causality is not reducible to a single chain of cause and effect. It is triadic, with each element of the system acting both as a cause and as an effect. The physical affects the mental affects the spiritual, and the spiritual loops back to influence the physical. Importantly, this interplay is not static. It is dynamic, constantly adjusting to maintain homeostasis. When one part of the system is disrupted, the others adapt to restore balance. This is why practices like mindfulness, gratitude, and meditation can have such profound effects on our overall well-being. They do not work by addressing only the body, the mind, or the spirit. They work by engaging the entire system, creating shifts that ripple outward through the triadic web. What makes this perspective so powerful is that it doesn't ask us to choose between materialist and non-materialist views. Instead, it integrates them, showing how physical processes, subjective experiences, and spiritual insights all co-arise and co-create one another. This integration doesn't just dissolve the false dichotomy between mind and matter, it transforms our understanding of causality itself. In this third way, causality is not about finding a single starting point or identifying a primary force. It is about recognizing the relationships that sustain and shape the whole system. Consider another example: creativity. Creativity is often described as a mental process, but in reality, it is deeply triadic. A physical state, such as relaxation or heightened arousal, can create the conditions for mental insights to emerge. These insights often connect to something deeper, a sense of purpose or inspiration that feels spiritual in nature. But this spiritual energy flows back through the system, fueling mental focus and physical energy. Creativity, like consciousness itself, is not the product of one domain, but the interplay between all three. This triadic perspective also has profound implications for how we approach change and transformation. Because mind, body, and spirit are interdependent, we can begin the process of change at any point in the system. A physical intervention, like improving sleep or practicing breath work, can ripple outward, creating mental clarity and spiritual openness. A cognitive shift, like reframing a challenge as an opportunity, can reduce physical stress and deepen spiritual connection. And a spiritual practice, like meditation or gratitude, can harmonize the entire system, fostering both mental and physical well-being. The entry point doesn't matter as much as the recognition that every element influences the others. Ultimately, this third way is not just a new model of causality, it is a new way of seeing consciousness itself. It shows us that consciousness is not something that resides in the brain or floats above the body. It is something that happens through us, emerging from the ongoing interaction of physical, mental, and spiritual forces. This view does not reduce consciousness to any one thing, nor does it separate it from the rest of existence. Instead, it reveals consciousness as a living, dynamic process, a system of interdependence that is as logical as it is profound. By embracing this triadic, homeostatic view, we move beyond the limitations of linear thinking and open ourselves to a deeper understanding of what it means to be conscious. This is the foundation we need to finally address the hard problem of consciousness. Not by simplifying it, but by embracing its full complexity. To understand consciousness as an emergent, triadic, and interconnected phenomenon, we need tools that reflect its complexity. The traditional dynamic model of consciousness provides one such tool. It attempts to explain consciousness as a spectrum of awareness, ranging from unconscious states to reflective self-awareness and ultimately to transcendent experiences. While this model has value, it often suffers from the same linear thinking that limits other frameworks, portraying consciousness as a ladder where one state gives rise to the next. A reconceptualization of the dynamic model, informed by interconnected causality, reveals something deeper. Consciousness is not a progression from lower to higher states. It is a system where all states coexist and influence one another in a homeostatic balance. Just as mind, body, and spirit are interdependent, so too are the levels of consciousness. The unconscious, reflective, and transcendent are not isolated or sequential. They are facets of the same process, each shaping and shaped by the others. For example, consider the experience of insight. Insight is often seen as a moment of reflective awareness, a flash of understanding that breaks through unconscious patterns. But that flash doesn't happen in isolation. It arises from the interplay between unconscious processes, like pattern recognition and emotional resonance. Reflective awareness, the conscious mind's ability to interpret and integrate. And a transcendent state, a sense of clarity or connection that feels beyond the self. Each of these levels is necessary, and each contributes to the emergence of insight as a unified experience. In this reconceptualized dynamic model, the focus shifts from linear progression to circular interaction. Rather than climbing a ladder of awareness, consciousness flows through a system of reciprocal influences where each level informs and supports the others. This perspective not only aligns with the triadic framework, but also allows us to see how practices like meditation, mindfulness, and altered states of consciousness work to harmonize the system as a whole. Our approach is reinforced by the Hermetic framework, which provides an even deeper lens for understanding the interdependence of consciousness. The Hermetic principles, mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender, offer a way of seeing reality that is profoundly triadic. While each principle has its own focus, together they describe a dynamic, interconnected system where everything arises in relationship. The principle of mentalism, for instance, teaches that the universe is fundamentally mental in nature, that all phenomena arise within a universal mind. But this isn't a one-sided assertion of non-materialism. Mentalism, when seen through the lens of interconnected causality, shows that the universal and the individual, the spiritual and the physical, are not separate. They are reflections of the same underlying process. Consciousness doesn't flow downward from a universal mind into individual awareness, nor does it arise upward from the physical brain. It flows through the system, linking the universal and the individual in a constant feedback loop. The principle of correspondence, as above, so below, expands on this interdependence by highlighting the fractal nature of reality. Just as mind, body, and spirit co-create consciousness, so too do the microcosm and macrocosm reflect one another. This principle invites us to see consciousness as holographic. Every part contains the whole, and the whole is expressed in every part. This isn't just an abstract metaphor, it has practical implications for how we understand and engage with consciousness. It means that changes at any level, physical, mental, or spiritual, can ripple outward, affecting the system as a whole. The principle of vibration complements this by describing consciousness as a state of motion. In the triadic framework, this motion is not linear or hierarchical. It is cyclical and dynamic, reflecting the interplay between levels of awareness. Lower vibrational states, like apathy or fear, are not disconnected from higher states, like love or transcendence. They are part of the same system, and shifts between them are driven by the interactions of physical, mental, and spiritual forces. Practices like breathwork or sound therapy, which alter vibrational states, don't work by isolating one element of consciousness. They work by harmonizing the triad, creating shifts that ripple through the entire system. Even the principle of polarity, often misunderstood as a dualistic concept, aligns with the triadic framework. Polarity does not divide reality into opposing forces. It reveals that affirmation and negation, light and dark, are degrees of the same spectrum. In consciousness, this means that every state contains its opposite, and balance is achieved not by erasing polarity, but by integrating it. For example, the interplay of reflection and transcendence, mental focus and spiritual openness, creates the conditions for insight, growth, and transformation. When we weave these principles together with the reconceptualized dynamic model, we arrive at a vision of consciousness that is not linear, hierarchical, or fragmented. It is a system of triadic relationships, guided by homeostasis, where mind, body, and spirit are in constant interplay. The levels of consciousness, unconscious, reflective, and transcendent, are not separate stages but interwoven facets of the same dynamic process. And the Hermetic principles provide a framework for understanding how this process operates, both within individuals and across the broader fabric of reality. This integration of the dynamic model and Hermetic framework doesn't just enhance our understanding of consciousness, it transforms it. It shows us that consciousness is not a puzzle to be solved, but a process to be engaged with. It invites us to move beyond reductionist thinking and embrace the complexity, fluidity, and interdependence that define what it means to be aware. The hard problem of consciousness has long been framed as a question of origins. How does subjective experience arise from physical processes? But this framing assumes a fundamental separation between experience and the physical world, a gap we've tried to bridge with increasingly complex theories. The truth is, the hard problem isn't a failure of imagination, it's a failure of perspective. When we see consciousness through the lens of interdependence, the problem shifts. Consciousness is not a thing to be explained by isolating its source. It is an emergent process, a dynamic, triadic system where mind, body, and spirit co-create one another in an ongoing interplay. Subjective experience isn't something added to the physical world or detached from it. It arises within the relationships that connect us, the physical sensations of the body, the interpretative processes of the mind, and the meaning and connection we find through the spirit. This shift in perspective dissolves the false duality at the heart of the hard problem. Qualia, the vivid what-it-is-like quality of experience, are not locked away in the brain or floating free in a universal mind. They are the product of relationships, how light, thought, memory, and meaning interact to create the redness of red, how sensation, emotion, and awareness combine to create the feeling of love. Consciousness is not a puzzle with missing pieces. It is the pattern of relationships that make life feel alive. Reframing consciousness as interdependent doesn't just help us rethink the hard problem. It reveals something deeper about existence itself. If consciousness is relational, then so too is reality. The mind does not exist apart from the body. The individual does not exist apart from the collective. Every action, thought, and feeling exists within a web of connection that extends far beyond us. This understanding challenges us. It asks us to embrace complexity and let go of the illusion of separateness. It invites us to see that our experiences, our growth, and even our suffering are not isolated phenomena but parts of a larger whole. And in doing so, it offers us a new way of seeing not only consciousness but ourselves as beings fundamentally interconnected, shaped by and shaping the fabric of existence. The hard problem of consciousness, when revisited through this lens, is no longer a roadblock. It is an opportunity. It invites us to expand how we think, to transcend the limits of linear causality and reductionist logic, and to step into a richer understanding of what it means to be conscious. In doing so, we move beyond simply explaining consciousness. We begin to live with an awareness of its profound and dynamic interdependence.